As with its predecessors, Half-Life Alyx has quite a lot of cut content from a long and fluid development history, stretching back to the development of the VR tech demo, The Lab. Numerous narrative ideas and gameplay concepts were created and tested to try and bring Half-Life Alyx to life. In reality, it's technically inaccurate for me to call any point of this development of Half-Life Alyx a beta or even an alpha, since everything is so fluid. Instead, I shall borrow the community's framing and look at the development of the game in eras of time. This second video will focus on the middle era of Alyx's development, which spanned roughly a year and a half. Unfortunately, we don't have exact dates for everything, so I've organized things as best as I could. This will also only cover officially released content from Valve or their artists. This includes the final hours of Half-Life Alyx, various social media posts, and content that was left behind in the game itself. The work for the first year or so in Alyx was primarily using an outline created by a story cabal. This acted as the spine to which gameplay and assets were being created for. This was the Cabal era. Despite nearly having a full story for the game, with many sequences considered, the Cabal era would come to a close when the writer Rob Yescombe would pen a complete script for the game. You'd begin writing this script in 2017, and continue to work on it through into 2018, resulting in some narrative changes even within this era, that I will note later on. The originally planned ship date was going to be sometime during the first half of 2019, alongside Valve's Index headset. Thus, the script would begin the Loop era. New assets and gameplay concepts were created for the game during this time. Certain components of the game wouldn't be added until after the Loop era. Much of that is related to in-game dialogue. Reportedly, nothing was recorded by hired voice actors for this version. Instead, developer voices and text-to-speech were used to convey dialogue. Related to this, there was nothing similar to Russell's radio conversations with Alyx by any of his predecessor characters. There were also debates on how much Alyx herself would talk, though it was seemingly going to be very sparse. Some other elements were built off of what was already being made, and worked on in the Cabal era. This includes bringing forward more parts of Half-Life 2 into Source 2. As Valve were porting and remaking Half-Life 2 characters, they would create a brand new Dr. Kleiner model for Source 2. This model would ultimately go unused, with the only reference to Dr. Kleiner in the retail game being an Easter egg on the first map. To build up the idea from the Cabal era of Dr. Breen's first Breen cast, a new Source 2 model was also built for him. Test dialogue would even be created for him, suggesting that he was at some point going to have a bigger role than just a broadcast.
Why would you want to fight against equality? In all my communications with the Combine, from negotiating our surrender to listening to their plans for the future, they've been nothing but rational. Let's not forget, they mastered interdimensional travel, they've all but wiped out the Vortigaunt menace that we brought upon ourselves, and they're in the process of cleaning up the quarantine zone for us.
In the end, the model would only go on to be used for propaganda, as well as the cover of a magazine.
As in the case of any Half-Life game, the first hour of Alyx must convey a lot of information to the player, hopefully in a natural and entertaining way. Players need to know who they are, where they are, what kind of world they're in, who the other important characters and factions are, and so on. At the same time, they need to learn how to actually play the game. How do they move? What can they interact with and how? What should they be trying to do, etc. Figuring out exactly what information we would try to convey in these first two levels, and how it would be conveyed, took us over 2 years of playtesting. It's tempting to try and include everything we think a player should know, but all information has a priority, and the more we include, the more chance there is that a player misses something important because they're distracted or confused by something less important.
The beginning of the game in the Loop era would have been very bleak in comparison to the game narratively before it, Half-Life 1. The initial levels would have shown citizens huddled in food ration lines, the Combine were rounding up Vortigaunts and parading their corpses through the streets. A particularly terrible district of City 17 would have been overrun with Zen debris, likely what would eventually become the quarantine zone. During the Cabal era, the Half-Life 2 Combine Soldier was the main Combine hostile, with a couple of variants being experimented with. They weren't as narratively involved though, likely just continuing what we knew of them from the previous games. Now in the Loop era, new infantry were being built based on these soldiers. New concept art was being generated for them, and new lore was also being written. Chief among them all was a Vortigaunt capture unit that would do those previously mentioned roundups. This work would eventually narrow the infantry types to 5. The Suppressor, the Charger, the Ordinal, the Grunt, and the Recon. The Ordinal and the Grunt, at least, were to prominently be in this Fort capture unit, sporting a special dark gray and yellow scheme, which the Ordinal maintains in the retail title. These new infantry would also go on to be more integrated into the story, beyond just the world building. The Combine also would have already captured Eli at this point. Having struck a deal with him to keep Alyx safe, Eli was going to record propaganda videos for the Combine and become the face of obedience with the new occupation. Work on these videos got far enough along that sequences for them were left on Eli's model, in the retail title. Unfortunately, any audio for them was left out, but these sequences do contain facial animations. This means that if you can lip read, you might be able to tell what exactly he says in them. The two of them were sequestered to a manor, guarded by the Combine. Some models from this place remain in the game. Some of them are reused in Alyx's hideout. They are located in the aptly named Eli Manor folder. The Combine official in charge of keeping Eli and Alyx was a person named Hahn. Hahn appears to have begun life as a male character. A bit of test dialogue was created for them, with a male temporary actor.
We don't shoot our friends, not unless they do something unfriendly. Save your enthusiasm for the inspection in Brassbound.
A temporary material for the character also featured male textures. An eye material for Hahn remains in the game as well. It's largely composed of G-Man eye textures. Eventually, it was settled to make Hahn a woman. She's described as having her brain sucked out by the Combine. Her final design would have looked like this. An anim graph, a type of scripting that helps AIs move and animate, remains in the retail title for Hahn. It's fairly simple and is mostly designed to let the Hahn NPC walk around. Alyx would be in conflict with Eli for his complicity with the Combine on her behalf. In one instance, Eli would put his foot down and would refuse to do another propaganda video, only to have Hahn torture him instead. The soundscape named A1 Intro Interior Hahn is listed in the soundscapes file for the first 2 maps. This is likely for the manor. It lists out 2 soundscapes and 2 individual sounds. The first of these sounds is in the game still, and named A1 Intro Garage LP, and sounds like this. The other sound is a cut piece of music. Alyx would somehow sneak out of the manor, and end up going to see Joseph. Joseph was an evolution of the Laszlo character from the Cabal era, and the second iteration of what would become Russell. Although it's unknown what exactly Joseph was going to ask Alyx to do, since Eli was stuck in the manor. Given what Laszlo was stated to do, it's likely that he would task Alyx with heading into the quarantine zone to find the Vortigaunt there. Joseph was to live in an old firehouse. An old Soviet fire truck model was actually created by Craig Collins. Despite the eventual setting change, many parts of Russell's current lab have behind-the-scenes references to Joseph Still. This includes model names, and an unused, though still visible, dynamic cable coming from the ceiling. Joseph also seems to have had a similar moment to when Russell tosses Alyx the gun, as a teleport point for him still exists at this window in the retail title.
Another challenge was balancing how often characters respond to player actions while delivering important narrative information. In early experiments, we allowed characters to stop mid-sentence, which allowed them to respond immediately to the player, and then continue on with their dialogue. While technically straightforward, this was incredibly difficult to execute in animation and dialogue without feeling unnatural. The combination of custom reactions necessary to cover the range of possible player interaction and the resulting return to narrative dialogue quickly multiplied out of control.
Like in the Cabal era, Alyx would eventually head into the quarantine zone and discover this lone Vortigaunt and his home.
There are 2 layers to the markings on the walls in this area. The square and dot patterns, that are the functional elements of the environmental puzzle, and the mural representing the Vortigaunt's interpretation of the events of the Half-Life saga. For the first few years of development, this area only contained the dot patterns supporting the perspective puzzle, but as we fleshed out the rest of the level, we found that playtesters responded especially positively to the Vortigaunt's wall markings leading up to the hideout.
While working on the murals and Gary's art, a set of messages from Gary were cut. They're not only in the game still, they're in the map file, only visible in Hammer. Here's what they say. After this, she would head inside into this room, his home. In there, a version of Gary's scene would play out. This early test version of the scene was in place by October 15th, 2018. In it, the player would squeeze nectar from headcrab hearts into the Vortigaunt's mouth to revive him. Some audio, likely from this specific scene, remains in the game.
When the citadel is completed, the weapon will be sent, and the fate of this organic sphere retreats into emptiness.
The fundamental challenge of any choreographed dramatic scene like this one is making sure that we entertain the player without undermining the delivery of critical gameplay information. In this case, the player needed to leave this scene with the knowledge that the Vortigaunts have been imprisoned and that the player should seek the Northern Star. This particular scene went through many different variations during development, from a cooking scene with an extremely traumatized Vortigaunt to this humorous version. We even experimented with an interaction where the player was required to squeeze the nectar of several headcrab hearts into the Vortigaunt's mouth to revive him. While this was a memorable and novel VR interaction that ensured the player was engaged with the scene, the interactivity on the player's part often resulted in playtesters remembering the actions they took, but not the critical gameplay information.
The Northern Star Hotel during the Cabal era didn't have a name, but was an important stop in the story. As heard previously, it was still an important element for Gary here in the Loop era. It was also where Zen foliage was being designed and experimented with.
One of the challenges the environment team faced when designing the Zen foliage was layering a new look onto an existing environment without having to rebuild Zen-infested versions of every prop. We relied heavily on texture blending and kit bashing of Zen foliage shapes to handle most of the big environmental changes when Zenifying a scene. We also added some new features to our level editor, Hammer, which allowed for more creative manipulation of assets to reduce repetition. For example, we could pose certain types of meshes such as the Zen tentacles. These could be placed, scaled, stretched and manipulated to snake through an environment, giving a handcrafted look without every asset having to be built for a specific location. These elements were editable in Hammer so they could be adjusted at any time, but were baked into static meshes when the map was compiled to improve their runtime performance.
While Zen flora in the Cabal era wasn't very specific, these plants would start to be defined more here in the Loop era. This work would then allow for the foliage to be applied elsewhere. While out in City 17, Alyx would meet some characters who would present to her business cards they had received from the G-Man. Each card had a unique word written on it, which the character would read aloud to Alyx. Rob Yescombe describes that this would have been a way to build the mythology of the G-Man, and would have paralleled Eli's reading of the cue cards for his videos. At some point during these adventures, Alyx would encounter the blind zombie in a factory. You were to first encounter him in a tenement building.
Many of our ideas for Jeff involved coming up with plausible ways to force Jeff and the player to occupy an enclosed space at the same time. An elevator ride was on the table from the beginning, but we were unsure of how successful it would be in execution. There was also a concern that such a sequence could be technically expensive to pull off. Our first prototype was extremely rudimentary. Players would get into an elevator with Jeff, the ride would last around 30 seconds, and then Jeff and the player would exit. There was no complicated level scripting, no bespoke animations for Jeff, and no special audio or lighting treatment. Despite the relative lack of polish, players had a strong positive reaction to the sequence, even naming it a highlight of the game when we ran company-wide playtests. This convinced us that it was worth putting more work into the elevator ride to make it something really special. In the end, a lot of different disciplines came together to create the final sequence, which combines sound, animation, scripted lighting, and careful choreography of Jeff's movements and the player's actions.
Since the entire premise of Jeff hinged on keeping Jeff and the player in close proximity to each other, the distillery map was constructed as a series of chambers connected by one-way transitions. Early on, we used two techniques in concert to keep Jeff and the player together throughout the level. First, each new area was gated with a special locked door. These took the form of impenetrable Zen membranes that only Jeff could tear through. The player would lure Jeff to the membrane using sound, and Jeff would break it open so that both Jeff and the player could proceed. We had always had a goal of having players describe Jeff in adversarial terms, as a constant pursuer or a thorn in their side. The problem with the Zen membrane concept was that it led to players describing Jeff as a useful tool, or worse, an angry co-op partner, rather than something they feared. Another way that we would keep Jeff and the player together was via the use of one-way drops. Jeff would fall off catwalks, platforms, and ladders into each new area. These drops functioned as intended, but just like the Zen membranes, elicited an undesirable reaction from players, especially when repeated multiple times. Watching Jeff do these pratfalls left players feeling like he was less dangerous. They felt sorry for him, and even laughed at him. Eventually, we realized that we could use combined force fields, which the player cannot pass through, as a way to create one-way doors. These force fields allowed Jeff to move through them, but required the player to follow via another one-way path. This allowed us to build thresholds where Jeff and the player could both move forward while eliminating the awkwardness of the Zen membranes, and avoiding the repeated falls that had previously made Jeff look so clumsy. Combined force fields also had a few other benefits. For one, they gave Jeff a convenient way to take a backstage route that is inaccessible to the player, like the one at the bottom of this ladder. They also tied in nicely with Jeff's fictional background as a former member of the Combine Zen cleanup crew.
This toner puzzle went through several revisions, many of which left Jeff free to roam while players worked on the puzzle. But this resulted in players having to juggle too many elements at once, and their fear of Jeff quickly turned into frustration. The solution was to keep Jeff locked up while players solved the puzzle, with his distant roars maintaining a level of tension. We were then left with the problem of how to release Jeff so the level could continue. Initial ideas involved having Jeff break out from the freezer on his own when the puzzle was complete, but this felt contrived and scripted compared to having the player free Jeff from the freezer. The toner puzzle mechanic gave us a logical solution to this problem, with the added benefit of creating a moment of high tension for the player when they realize they're going to have to open the freezer door and release Jeff in order to proceed.
The scientist didn't exist during this era, so that when they went to create her, they had to replace some loop arrow level geometry for her scene.
Of course, then the scene still had to be built. Level designers figured out what existing chunk of level track could be bumped out to fit the scene. The area we chose previously held some barnacles and a few light puzzle elements, which the designers weren't upset to lose. The level track had to be altered to funnel you into a place where the scene could unfold and the player could eavesdrop without getting a good look at the character.
Creating a climactic battle that capped off the antlion combat proved to be a challenging design problem. We wanted to create a sustained combat experience that was substantial enough to challenge players who had refined their skills against the antlions. But simply throwing a large number of antlions at the player all at once was not a particularly engaging experience, nor was it compatible with our established combat balancing. Rather than containing the player in a restricted space and spawning waves of enemies, we wanted to keep the player engaged and moving through a gauntlet of constant pressure toward a goal. To do this, we needed an arena with a clear linear flow and a porous layout that would allow the player to maintain sight of their goal while being flanked by swarms of antlions as they move toward it. This tanker yard, which we had originally built for a narrative scene that was cut from the game, had the properties we were looking for. The long tanker cars lead toward the intended direction of travel, and their positioning requires the player to pay careful attention to their sides and rear as they advance.
The goal of this puzzle was to create a moment of heightened stress by requiring players to deal with a sudden threat after being placed in a precariously disadvantageous position. In the original design of the puzzle, players would stand on a platform which was suspended from a cable and pull themselves across the chasm. Halfway across, antlion spitters would emerge and start attacking. The platform provided limited cover, and players would have to make trade-offs between taking cover and continuing to propel themselves forward. This succeeded in creating the desired spike in intensity, but unfortunately, the lateral movement of the platform caused considerable motion sickness for most playtesters. Even players who were comfortable with the vertical movement of elevators elsewhere in the game were adversely affected here.
The Strider had been an idea experimented with during the Cabal era. In 2017, a VR prototype level set in a quarry was developed. This level, which you are seeing in the background, was designed to act as an encounter with the Strider, including a bit of combat against it.
Based on the success of this prototype, the team moved on to building the shipping experience ahead of you, although it would take another 3 years of refinement to complete. Each iteration brought us a new set of rules and players' expectations. The Strider encounter ahead is a carefully crafted collection of beats shaped by our own ideas of what would be exciting and fun, refined over a long period of playtest. For many players, Striders are the most feared and powerful enemies in the Half-Life franchise, and we thought it would be interesting to flip player expectations on their head and experience what it would feel like to team up and cooperate with a Strider. Our initial concept was inspired by Aesop's fable of the Lion and the Mouse, with the player freeing a disabled Strider, who would later help the player escape by clearing the way forward. Initially, the parking garage was a Combine silo, and it was much easier fictionally to have some type of Combine device which could constrain a Strider without injury. When the location changed to a collapsed parking garage, we constrained the Strider by trapping it in the elevator shaft, held down by the elevator car. After being freed, the injured Strider would lash out at anything nearby, Combine and player alike, as it tried to escape. This was a strong story when told aloud, but expressing it in a way that was understood by players turned out to be difficult. Keeping the Strider around throughout the level, alternating between injured and angry states as the player slowly picked their way through the garage, was confusing to playtesters, and we had a very hard time trying to find the right balance. Playtesting feedback was really consistent around this. So although we loved the idea, we let it go in favor of a more straightforward and achievable dynamic of hunter and prey that eventually shipped. The year we spent pursuing the lion and a mouse idea wasn't wasted, however, as we created and refined many of the different story beats that shipped. We also crafted some performances and technology that led to the success of the final experience.
When the central theme of this map was the lion and the mouse, the encounter with the Strider ended at this point. The Strider simply exited off into the sunset. We intended for the Strider to reappear in a subsequent fight, perhaps even attacking the Combine alongside the player, but this idea was only pursued briefly before being cut.
When playtesting the Strider encounter, we learned that players enjoyed fighting a challenging enemy but responded negatively if they took damage in a way that seemed unfair. To address this, we used audio to communicate the state of the Strider. For example, when the Strider did not have line of sight to the player, it would emit a periodic hunting sound. This sound was meant to communicate to the player that they were currently safe, but that the Strider was still there. Once the Strider had seen the player, it would switch to its chasing state and make corresponding chasing sounds. When the Strider was ready to start firing at the player, it would emit a target-acquired sound before firing. Players quickly learned this pattern of sound cues, and no longer complained about being caught unaware of the Strider's targeting state.
In all versions of the ending, Alyx was to arrive at the vault and free the G-Man. This is something that goes back to the story Cabal.
Half-Life Alyx was set in a realistic type world with familiar rules. The G-Man's presence in the vault gave us fictional justification to experiment with different distortions of reality and embrace surrealism in these spaces. Early experiments with gravity anomalies and distorting spatial expectations were promising as the immersiveness of VR worked to exaggerate their impact. The surreal environments proved to be fertile for puzzle solving as well, but they tended to stall the pacing at the point in the game we needed it to be ramping up, so they weren't included in the final release.
The more surreal things got in the vault, the harder it became to design puzzles that felt appropriately abstract but still understandable. We found through testing that, at this stage in the game, players were hungry for a narrative payoff, and further puzzles just ran the risk of becoming frustrations. After some experimentation with more complex interactions, we settled on a more theatrical presentation of the moment that the player frees the G-Man.
In Robbie S. Combs' very original idea for the ending, Alyx's reward for freeing the G-Man was to take her back in time to prevent Gordon from placing the sample in the anti-mass spectrometer in Half-Life 1. Her doing this would have prevented him from triggering the resonance cascade and the 7-Hour War. This ending wasn't prototyped. Instead, 2 other endings were concepted out, both of which involved looping back to the beginning of the game. The first version was one where G-Man would give Alyx a business card herself. She'd go back in time to the manor with the card and read it aloud to Eli. This would change their fates and the events of the game. The second and most finalized version of this ending was one where after freeing the G-Man, Alyx would go back in time with the supercharged gravity gloves and use them to kill Hahn and the Combine under her control. This appears to be the most finalized one because a few assets were created for it and remain in the retail title. A dedicated animated model of a Combine grunt exists within the game still, and includes a lot of remaining animations for this killing sequence. At least 2 grunts were to be present, given the 2 separate choreos. A version of Alyx, likely a past version of herself, would be seen in this ending too. The model used for her at the end of the retail game has 2 unused animations, titled Manor Finale. On top of this, several particle effects related to these specific animations, all themed around Alyx vanishing, were also made, and can still be found in the game. While the lore, narrative, and art elements for these new Combine infantry were being put into place, the gameplay side was continuing. Each of these 5 infantry had their own niche, seemingly built off of their soldier variants they prototyped. The suppressor would carry a large machine gun to fire upon enemies, carrying on the idea of the suppression soldier. The charger would continue the gameplay concepts of the shotgunner from Half-Life 2, using a massive shotgun to fire upon hostiles. The Ordinal, or Captain, was what came out of the Commander variant, and would lead the squads of Combine. The Grunt would become the base infantry, taking the place of the standard soldier. The Recon, which would get cut in the end, appears to have had the ability to signal for further reinforcements during fighting. The Recon would seemingly accomplish this by placing a flare. Particle effects for this remain in the retail game. After early Cabal-era tests with the original Soldier AI from Half-Life 2, Valve began to notice some gameplay behaviors from playtesters.
It was clear from these early playtests that the most common reaction among players was to immediately seek cover from enemy fire. So we started experimenting with changes to the Soldier AI, aimed at building a combat experience around players' tendency to seek cover. Early experiments were focused on keeping Combine soldiers at a comfortable distance from the player, while keeping them moving around enough to not have combat become too static. To create lulls in firing for players to peek out from cover, we prevented soldiers from shooting while on the run in most cases. To keep players from remaining stationary, we created a concept of flushing, where squads will attempt to flush the player out of cover, and we gave each class of soldier a different method of flushing out the player. But even in these early tests, it was also clear that players weren't capable of fighting soldiers until they'd gotten skilled in a number of basic combat actions, like reloading their gun without having to focus all their attention on it.
One problem we faced with the VR movement styles that Alyx supported was keeping the combat experience from diverging based upon whether players were using teleport or continuous movement. If the combat was significantly different depending on the player's movement setting, our playtesting requirements could explode combinatorially. One way that we prevented this combinatorial explosion was by ensuring that AIs could sense player movement no matter which locomotion style the player was using. To do this, we created a visual proxy for players using teleport locomotion. Imagine a scenario where the player is behind cover, hidden from a soldier's sight. If the player used continuous movement to run to another piece of nearby cover, the soldier would see them while they were out in the open. But a player who instantly teleported from one piece of cover to the next would not be seen. To solve this discrepancy, when a player teleports, we leave a breadcrumb trail of invisible visual proxies, which the enemy AI can see. These proxies pass information to the AI similar to what it would have gathered from seeing the player perform the movement directly. In this case, the soldier would know the teleporting player had left the original cover and run across open ground to the new cover, just like a player using continuous motion. While obviously not identical, in that the soldier didn't have a chance to take a shot at the teleporting player, these kinds of features did allow us to reduce the number of ways our AI logic needed to take player movement options into consideration.
Valve also created concept art for a combinified horse and soldier jockey. One Combine unit that would see a return was the Hunter Chopper. Some experiments for it involve the bomb dropping attacks, since the bombs can be found in the files still. After initial positive feedback on the physical pistol reload in the Cabal era, Valve made the sequence require 2 different buttons to do it.
In the early stages of the game, players would be fumbling for clips, ejecting the clips when they meant to be chambering around, and generally making a mess. To those of us observing the playtest, this looked like things had gone horribly wrong, but players themselves consistently cited this as a high point of their playthroughs. Because of the physical nature of the reload, and the skill required, players blamed themselves and not the game for the mistakes made as they were learning the reloading.
Due to the lack of a tangible, physical weight to the in-game guns, experiments with two-handed weapons during the Cabal era resulted in people constantly trying to reposition their hands, sort of taking them out of the game.
Since one of our core goals with Half-Life Alyx was to allow players to fully immerse themselves by ceasing to think about what they were doing in real life, we decided to focus on single-handed weapons, including the shotgun.
Our initial instinct with the shotgun design was to use a regular real-world shotgun, but modified, with a sawn-off stock and barrel so it would seem less cumbersome when held with one hand. This approach always resulted in the handle being at the rear of the weapon, and we ran into the problem where the weapon always felt front-heavy. Obviously, the VR controller in your hand wouldn't reflect that, leading to a disconnect between what you were feeling and what you were seeing. Placing the handle more centrally and underneath the weapon helped avoid this disconnect. This implied centre of mass wasn't really maintained well as the weapon accrued upgrades throughout the game, but the first impression was the most critical. Since we were going with an odd form, we were keen to use common shotgun visual elements wherever we could to help with player recognition and to ground the design in some reality. One element we borrowed was a common shotgun tube magazine that stores shells horizontally in line with the barrel, and we were just able to fit the gameplay requirement of 6 shells without the overall length becoming unwieldy. You can see the effort we had to go for further shell capacity in the design of our autoloader upgrade. Our first reloading mechanic was based on the realistic insertion of one shell at a time. Playtesters found this to be overly tedious, although we did receive some positive comments that it made them feel like an action movie star. The simple addition of allowing the players to insert 2 shells at a time solved this issue, allowing us to keep the good part of the design whilst losing the bad. We were keen to reinforce the whole action movie star thing, and experimented with some big gesture the player could do to finalise reloading. The inclusion of a pop-up mechanism allowed us to add an additional step to the reload that further separated it from our other weapons, yet had a satisfying flick of the wrist to complete the action.
As work continued for the weapon upgrades, the Combine Fabricator would be created by Tristan Reedford.
Internally, we refer to this type of puzzle as a toner puzzle, due to its similarity to a real-world cable toner tool that can be used to locate electrical wires in walls. The toner mechanic was conceived as a tool for designers to craft player experiences around knowing that the player had to put their head and hands in specific locations. The initial design merely required the player to use their multi-tool to push a ball of energy along a path, similar to a child's bead maze toy. While this simple design was successful at getting the player to put their head and hands in particular locations, the lack of branching meant that the player wasn't required to make any choices, nor was there any possibility of negative consequences. To address these issues, we added the rotating junction elements, which allowed for branching paths and became the player's primary means of interacting with toner puzzles.
Sometimes large chunks of a level are shifted around or reordered as we work on the game. That's the case for this entire area and the toner puzzle it's centered around. In fact, for much of its existence, this area didn't even have a home anywhere in the game. It was originally built just to help prototype the toner puzzle mechanic. Over the course of a few months, the raw gameplay mechanics of toner puzzles were developed and playtested in a series of small test levels. Each test level explored a single gameplay concept. Those were things like using the toner puzzle to draw the player's eyes to something interesting, such as Zen flora and fauna, creating moments of surprise when an enemy head crab popped out of a vent, or requiring the player to thread their arm and hand in behind pipes or other tight spaces. Once we figured out which of these ideas were working well, we combined them into a single test level with the toner puzzle that strung all these concepts together in one single puzzle. Further playtesting in this level made us confident that toner puzzles should be included in the game, and we started adding them into other areas. But we didn't include the test level itself anywhere in the game.
One frustration players may encounter in VR is having to physically bend down or reach out for objects in the virtual world, especially if they have limited real-world space. A common solution for this is to provide a way to bring objects to the player, instead of forcing the player to go to them. We knew this would be an important feature in Half-Life Alyx, with its sprawling levels and players' desire to explore every corner of the world. We didn't want this mechanic to feel too gamey or magical, so we decided to integrate it into the fiction of the game by making it a feature of the gravity gloves, which are a natural precursor to the gravity gun of Half-Life 2. This allowed us to present the mechanic as a real physical action that's enabled by a piece of in-fiction technology. To emphasize the physicality that is unique to the medium of VR, we used a physical gesture to activate the pull instead of a button press, and then required the player to actually catch the object instead of automatically attaching it to the hand. This made the mechanic feel more natural and rooted in the fiction of the game's universe, while allowing the player to feel powerful and accomplished.
When a player pulls an object with the gravity gloves, we use the game's physics engine to apply a launch force to that object with a trajectory that is partially influenced by the direction of the player's pull gesture. We set the object's launch velocity to result in a standard flight time from pull to catch, so the player can develop a rhythm that eventually becomes automatic. We want the object to arrive at the hand as reliably as possible, so after the initial launch, we continually apply small impulse forces along the trajectory, represented by the white arrows. Those impulses help counter gravity and compensate for collisions with obstacles along the way, while continuously steering the object toward the hand, which is itself a moving target. A generous catch range and subtle haptic feedback when the object enters that range virtually guarantees that it will end up in the player's hand every time, even if their attention is focused elsewhere. One other benefit of implementing this with physics is that we didn't need to do custom handling for an object's size, mass, or inertia, and it automatically compensated for the non-standard gravity that players encounter inside the vault at the end of the game.
Although it may seem obvious that throwing would be a trivial interaction to support in VR, a lot of nuanced work is required to get it to feel right. And if we were going to build puzzles like this one, where the player must throw an armed grenade through a high duct, throwing needed to work well. A typical VR game running at 90 frames per second will read the sensor data from the track controllers once per frame. This means the data is read every 11 milliseconds. That may seem like a short time step, but when throwing, a user can easily move their hand 15 centimeters or more in that amount of time. Additionally, the player may release the object by opening their hand or releasing the trigger at any point during their throwing motion. This makes reconstructing the act of throwing a virtual object an interesting signal processing problem. It's up to any given piece of VR software to derive the player's intent from the discretely sampled controller data, and we've learned a lot over the years about what works and what doesn't. In the lab, which we shipped in 2016, we sampled the controller's positional data every 11 milliseconds and used the sampled positions to compute the controller velocity at each time step. We then used an average of the computed velocity and direction over several frames before and after the object release to determine the velocity and direction to apply to the thrown object. Although this was functional enough to ship, it didn't always feel consistent, especially if the game's frame rate ever fell below 90 frames per second. Later, in the Index controller tech demo Moondust, we expanded on this algorithm by biasing towards higher velocity data. We also extended the SteamVR software interface to provide the controller's instantaneous velocity and acceleration data from the hardware inertial measurement unit, which is computed on the controller every 2 milliseconds. This meant that we did not have to calculate an estimate from the positions sampled by the engine only every 11 milliseconds as we had done on the lab. This was crucial to providing a more responsive feel, as it meant the throwing calculations were no longer tied to the rendering frame rate. After further experimentation, we arrived at the solution used in Half-Life Alyx, which takes 10 frames that preceded the release of the held object and averages the 3 frames bracketing the peak controller velocity in that time window. We have found that this tends to lead to a better approximation of precisely when the player intended to release a thrown object. This approach resulted in consistent, comfortable throwing, enabling us to rely on players being able to accurately throw grenades or any other objects with confidence.
With the original idea of using Half-Life 2 health kits in the Cabal era being replaced with CSGO-inspired health pens, work began on how to get them to function.
Players would press a button to arm the injector as a way of indicating their intent to use it. This prevented unintentional use of the injector and gave us an opportunity to showcase how physical the interaction was going to be via haptics, animation, and sound. Some testers even initially responded with dread over the fact they were going to have to use a needle on themselves and looked away when performing the injection action. We also had to create approximations of the player's arms and body, as playtesters all had their own preferences for where they wanted to apply the injection. We even added the ability to inject into the head since so many players tried to do it just to see if it would work.
Valve were running into issues with players and their habits and ammo collection, and began to investigate this as a resource placement issue.
So, at its core, the problem with resource placement is that the dynamic range of resources carried by players can be significant, and it gets even wider as the game progresses. In Half-Life Alyx, we would see some players end the game with barely any ammunition, while other players had over 1,000 unused rounds.
So how can we handle resource placement when there's such a wide dynamic range in player collections and usage patterns? Like many games, we opted for a dynamic system that looks at the player's current resource counts and makes decisions based on them. But the design of these kinds of systems can be tricky, because they tend to affect player behavior. For instance, in Half-Life 2, we placed breakable crates throughout the game which dynamically spawned resources based on the player's current health and ammo levels. This had the advantage of allowing us to not need a huge amount of playtesting for resource balancing, because as long as there were enough crates around, the player would always have enough resources. But because that system exists, we didn't have to spend much time on resource placement, and as a result, we didn't really craft challenges around resource collection. Players also learned that they didn't need to really care about the resource levels, because the crates were always going to top them up on whatever they needed most. For Half-Life Alyx, we wanted to revisit those assumptions. We knew that searching for resources in a VR environment was something players really enjoyed. So we wanted resource collection to be something players needed to do throughout the entire game, and that meant we didn't want them to ever reach the point where they had so much ammo and health that they didn't need to explore. We were also able to start playtesting earlier in the product development cycle than we had been able to when making Half-Life 2, which gave us the confidence that we'd be able to spend the time we needed to carefully place every resource.
For Half-Life Alyx, we moved to a system that allowed us to craft a more specific experience, using a dynamic layer that attempts to reduce the dynamic range of resource gathering between players. Instead of placing generic resources that switch types, level designers carefully placed each resource type throughout the world. Some are easy to find, and some are more difficult. Then, as the player moves forward in the world, the system opportunistically removes resources in the path ahead based on the player's current resource levels. This had the benefit of allowing level designers to have a lot of control over the player's resource amounts in different areas of the game. They were able to craft areas where they wanted the player to be starved of one ammo type or encouraged to use another.
In a 2018 build of the game, ladders were movable objects that could also be put in the wrist storage. The blind zombie, what ended up becoming Jeff, began development in the Cabal era. In that time, he was a combine robot with rebar-filled concrete stuck in his head. He also had a giant claw. Briefly, he was redesigned as the cremator from the Half-Life 2 beta, trading in his claw for some sort of weapon. He would, however, continue to be reconceptualized, this time going more and more biological, while at the same time solving gameplay challenges that they were running into.
One of the trickier aspects of designing Jeff was striking the right balance between perceived threat and actual threat. Many scenarios in the level forced the player into close proximity with Jeff in order to create tension. We found that these moments could be exciting, but they could also become frustrating when players accidentally got too close to Jeff and were killed unexpectedly. Players reported not understanding how close is too close. We tried a number of solutions, such as adding glowing tentacles to Jeff that acted as a visual representation of the perimeter of his personal space. Touch the tentacles, and you die. Getting the look and feel of these tentacles to a satisfactory place proved challenging, however, and we backed away from the idea.
As the blind zombie was heavily focused on audio, there was one proposed sequence where the player was going to throw an object against a breakable wall. Jeff would be attracted to this sound and use his gun to break the wall.
Creating an experience with such a heavy focus on audio presented some unique design problems. The primary challenge was determining which sounds Jeff should be able to hear and making sure that players understood the rules. Half-Life Alyx contains a vast array of physics objects. However, through playtesting we found it best to use only a small set of them in the distillery. We needed to pay close attention to each object that we did include, particularly to audio design for collisions between the object and the various surface types used in the distillery. It was important that what players heard matched their expectations for how Jeff would react. In early testing, we would find individual cases where players would say things like, "I don't know why Jeff got angry," or "I would have expected that noise to attract Jeff." Over time, we identified these cases of confusion and addressed them one by one. It was vital that players always be able to identify the cause and effect of a noise that might attract Jeff.
Some concept work was also created to show how this biological Jeff was immune to gunfire. When a bullet hit the blind zombie, his body would essentially encase and then spit out the bullet. Similar to the soldiers, antlions were ported straight from Half-Life 2 into VR during the Cabal era. These tests resulted in people spending more time trying to get away from the antlions than fighting them.
Around the same time, we were discovering that all players, even relative novices, have surprisingly good aim in VR. The variability of aiming ability amongst players is simply much lower in VR than it is in mouse and keyboard games. To take advantage of the idea that players would consistently be able to make precise shots, we started testing an antlion design which players could slow down by shooting off the legs. Playtesters reacted positively to both the need for accuracy and the organic feeling that this gave the antlions when their legs flew off and the injured antlion continued to limp toward them.
There were very few existing antlion sounds to work with coming into Half-Life Alyx, so unlike most of the familiar Half-Life creatures, which often had legacy sounds layered in, nearly all of the sounds for the antlions were completely new material. Starting with an almost blank canvas, we drew inspiration from the behavior of the antlions to inform their sound design. Since the antlions attack in waves, it seemed reasonable to us that they communicated and organized into groups for attack. This idea led us to incorporate complex insect-like clicking sounds, the final version of which began as recordings of European starlings, which turned out to provide more variation and character than insect recordings. Here you can hear the original European starling sounds. We took those recordings and layered them with designed elements to create the antline sounds used in the game.
The zombies would be updated to high definition, being based on the Half-Life 2 design quite closely. New zombie designs would be created as well, to complement the classic design. This work on the zombie would eventually lead to work on humanoid musculature and muscle deformation. This can be seen in the video in the background, which demonstrates this on one of the completed zombie models. A new type of headcrab was being considered too, the armored headcrab. Originally, the armored headcrab was going to be made partly out of crystals. There was one design based on the fast zombie. A fast headcrab was also considered for a time to be included in the game. The model remains in the retail title, with a plethora of animations. Among these animations, you can find one for it hanging upside down from the ceiling, and one of it drowning. Both are ported from the Half-Life 2 Fast Headcrab. The Fast Headcrab would also go on to help with the development of the Reviver, what was originally called the Runner.
The Reviver, one of the new enemy types introduced in Half-Life Alyx, arose from our observation that playtesters enjoyed searching their environment in VR much more than they had in traditional games. In addition to rewarding that desire to search with ammunition and resin, we experimented with how it could be part of fighting an enemy. We began prototyping with a fast headcrab variant we called the Runner, modifying its behaviour to run away and hide from the player after it attacked. We found players really enjoyed looking for a small, hidden enemy they knew was somewhere within a dense environment. They also liked shooting at a fast-moving enemy that was able to run under and behind everyday objects like tables and chairs. Lastly, players talked about liking the way they got to be the aggressor in combat for once, since everywhere else in the game they felt like they were always on the defensive. While feedback was overall very positive, there was one specific problem: how to encourage players to search for the Runner. After a few Runner encounters, we found players would start to realise they didn't have to look for the Runner at all, they could simply wait for it to run away and then leave the room. So we started prototyping various ways in which the Runner could become more dangerous if not found, setting up a time pressure where players had to find the Runner quickly or the situation would get worse. After some experimentation, we landed on the prototype where the Runner could revive a fallen zombie and become a new kind of foe, one that was more dangerous than a Runner or zombie. After this change, the Runner was renamed internally to the Reviver, and we began assembling the various encounters around it. It took a lot of playtesting to balance out all the various elements of the Reviver fights, because they involved multiple separate stages: combat versus the Reviver, searching for a hidden Reviver, and combat versus a revived zombie. In the end, we still didn't feel like we'd created enough of a foolproof reason for players to need to search for hidden Revivers, so we turned the Reviver's heart into a key, requiring players to collect it.
An enemy's animation can elicit a powerful emotional response from players, especially in VR. While developing the Reviver, we learned that sometimes a character performance can have unintended consequences. In our initial Reviver prototypes, we simply used a blue-tinted headcrab model with rudimentary electrical effects. The prototype was successful enough in playtesting that we decided to invest in a new, purpose-built model for the Reviver, with electrical skin and improved effects. Players identified the new Reviver successfully in the game, but we ran into a new problem. Players didn't want to fight it anymore. While the blue headcrab was easily identified as something dangerous, the new model was something that players had to evaluate from scratch, and they didn't necessarily see it as threatening. In fact, the animations authored for the new Reviver model were interpreted by many players as friendly or even cute. Players would often approach the creature to try to pet it, or worse, refuse to kill it to retrieve the required puzzle piece, blocking their progression in the game. If they did then realize that they were going to have to kill the cute creature to proceed, they felt horrible having to go through with it.
One of the challenges with the Reviver's resurrection mechanic was training players that the Reviver was the target, and the zombie was effectively just an inert vehicle that could not be damaged. This was a significant departure from what we had been training players to expect. Up until this point in the game, players would see a zombie, shoot at it, and as long as they hit it enough times, it would die. The Reviver breaks that expectation, and in early tests, players thought the game was broken when the zombie wouldn't die or even react to being shot.
In our early designs, a revived zombie was just an invincible zombie with a moving vulnerable spot. Playtesting revealed this to be less tense and threatening than the Reviver on its own, and since we wanted the revived zombie to be a higher stakes adversary, we needed to enhance its offensive capabilities. As a natural extension of the electrified nature of the Reviver, we chose to create an electrical field around the revived zombie, so that players who got too close would take heavy electrical damage. This worked well for many playtests, until we observed a player who was a proficient real-world marksman. This player was able to easily defeat the revived zombie without ever being threatened by it. In response, we gave the revived zombie its electrified ground counterattack, which forces players to change positions to avoid damage. This created a cadence of attack and retreat that was more tense and satisfying for all players.
The Snark was also intended to be seen unbound in City 17, with numerous unused animations remaining for it in the retail title. It could walk, jump, and turn. At one point, the player was able to pick it up. And could have attempted to squeeze it. Some animations for the Snark also mention a lab. This might have been for Joseph's lab at the firehouse.
Barnacles, while an iconic Half-Life creature, presented some interesting VR-specific challenges. While their tongue is intended to trap hasty or unobservant players, those caught by them often didn't realize what was happening. They would become disoriented or even motion sick as the barnacle lifted them up to be eaten. These unfortunate players almost universally died and failed to learn what was happening even after multiple encounters. To address this issue, we created the tongue as a particle system. This allowed us to both physically simulate it as well as reliably position it for maximum visibility. If a player does get grabbed by a barnacle, the tongue always wraps right in front of their face, no matter which direction they try to look. This makes the tongue almost impossible to miss and visually guides the player's eyes up to the location of the barnacle, so they know where to shoot to free themselves. These fixation visuals that kick in as the player is being lifted not only serve to communicate the damage the player is taking, but they also help to reduce motion sickness by narrowing the player's field of view. These changes, combined with sound effects and other visuals like seeing stars and blacking out, eliminate confusion for players and enabled us to bring this classic enemy into the world of Half-Life Alyx.
Half-Life Alyx supports 3 types of player movement: continuous movement, shift teleport, and blink teleport. Early on, one of the properties of blink teleport, and to a lesser degree shift teleport, was that players would often refer to the actual mechanic of teleporting when describing their movement through the environment. I teleported to the desk, or I teleported into cover, was often how players would describe their actions, and it served as an unconscious reminder that they were interacting with a game in a specific way. To address this, we made a couple of key changes early on that significantly altered the way players recounted their movement, and as a result, pulled them further into a more convincing virtual reality. One of these changes was the visual indicator that represented the teleport destination. We swapped the abstract cylindrical indicator used in the lab for a pair of holographic feet. The feet helped provide a sense of physical presence and indicated the direction the player would face upon finishing a teleport. We also added animated feet between the player's current location and the teleport target. These feet illustrated the path the player would traverse, further helping provide a fiction for their movement through the environment. Along with the visual interface changes, we also added audio of footsteps and body movements that would play after a teleport to effectively summarize the player's movement through the space. This isn't something everyone necessarily notices at first, but it is quite obvious when it's missing or incorrect. The footstep audio transformed how players described their movement through the world, and players would often refer back to movement in the environment as walking or running, as opposed to referring to game terminology.
Following a company-wide internal playtest of Half-Life Alyx, it was decided that the game would be reworked. This mainly included the game's narrative, resulting in a completely new plot and a whole new set of characters being added. That transformation would start the game's pre-retail era.